Hello everyone and welcome to this video on project success, objectives and benefits. So in this video we're going to be looking at a question that should really be quite simple. How do we actually know if a project is successful, but is a little bit more complex than it first appears, but is really important as well for us to understand before we start planning or trying to conceive of particular projects, how we're going to arrange the qualification of the success of that project, or how we're going to judge the success criteria for the project itself. So it is worth us looking into this in a bit more detail. So if we consider project success, so if we work our way backwards and try to understand, well, if this is a successful project, if we're happy with the project, why could that be, or why would we judge this particular project a success? And we can actually develop quite a few different reasons for this. So if we go through some of these one by one to explore what they can actually tell us about the successful project itself. So first here being just a pretty straightforward question of, did you complete all of the activities? So we have a set project scope, and we use things like the work breakdown structure as well as a scope statement to define a scope. So if you have successfully completed all of the activities in your work breakdown structure, that's one element of considering the project a success. This does bring into focus, however, the importance of treating the work breakdown structure as a definition of scope, including everything that needs to be done for the project to be successful in the work breakdown structure, and excluding everything else. So if there's an activity which really has to be done, it belongs in a work breakdown structure as one of the branches of the work breakdown structure. But more importantly, anything which is not in the work breakdown structure is not part of the scope of the project. This is an important tool that project managers use to protect the resources they have, and to avoid other stakeholders from adding activities on. So you may have a project within an organization, and there's multiple heads of department or multiple team leaders who all want to add a few additional activities to your project because they see it as a useful way of getting things done, which are not part of the business as usual or not part of the operational roles. However, this can make the project very messy and actually damage the chances of project success. So using the work breakdown structure to define and protect the scope of the project is quite important, and that helps contribute to a successful project. As well as this, the next thing we can use to try and understand a successful project would be staying under or on budget, so staying within your constraints. Now you have a cost budget, but you also typically have a time budget as well. So did you manage to complete all of the activities within the time that you had planned for, and within the cost budget that you've identified would be a key part of project success. And that's one easy way that we can actually measure whether the project actually ran well. So these are things that you would do in the second stage of the four-stage project lifecycle. So this is the design stage. This is where you have all of your planning documents. This is where you develop your scheduling plan. This is where you develop a detailed work breakdown structure. This is where you have your detailed budget as well. So if you manage to stay on track with all of these planning documents, you manage to stay within the costing of the project, you manage to get all of the work completed with your timeline and within the schedule plan, then that's another pretty key element of saying, well, this was a successful project. This was a project that achieved what needed to achieve within the constraints of the plans that we developed. The third element of trying to judge project success would be a really important one. This isn't relating to plans, but relating to stakeholders. So in the first stage of the four-stage project lifecycle model, the define stage, you would actually identify your stakeholders. So these are individuals, entities, or parties that are affected by your project and have some interest in your project. It can be stakeholders that are very obvious. So let's say you're developing a new website for internal use. Well, your direct stakeholders may well be the IT department, who are expected to bear a significant amount of work to actually carry it out, as well as the various vendors who may be contributing to platforms, but also the users as well. So people who are directly going to be using the internal website, as well as management staff or whoever else has a direct stake or indirect stake in the project. So you would collect your requirements from your stakeholders, you identify them, you speak to them, you find out what they ideally want from the project, what they want from the output or the deliverable from the project. And then at the end of the project, if your stakeholders are more or less happy, that's a key indicator that your project was successful. So this highlights the importance of actually talking to your stakeholders and collecting their requirements during the define stage of the project, the first stage of the project lifecycle, and having that genuinely impact and affect your planning for the project in the second stage, the design stage. So if you're ignoring your stakeholders, if you believe that you as the project manager knows best how this project should proceed, and then your stakeholders are unhappy at the end of the project, then regardless of what you believe to be the correct solution, it's not a successful solution. So you're not creating something, a deliverable, for the sake of it. You're doing so to satisfy certain stakeholders and to fill a need or solve a problem. If you think as a project manager you've solved the problem by creating the best possible internal website, but your users aren't happy, your stakeholders aren't happy, and they're not engaging with the website, or they're not using the functionality as intended, then regardless of what you feel as a project manager, that's not a successful project. It's really important to put the stakeholders really at the center of your definition and your planning when it comes to any given project. So identifying happy stakeholders at the end is a strong sign that your project was actually a success. Now, if we move on to the next two, the last remaining two boxes on the screen, we're going to tackle these together because these are slightly different from the others in that they're not just useful insights and reminders to us when we're developing the project and defining the project, but they're also measurable items. So meeting project objectives and achieving the intended benefits are two related but different types of ways of monitoring, measuring project success, and really helping us stay on track. So we are going to look at these two in more detail, as well as looking at what project objectives and project benefits actually are. So if we start with the first, which is project objectives, and just take a look at what project objectives actually are in reality. So they're objectives which should be set at the very start of the project. So when you develop the business case in the defined stage, the first stage of the life cycle, you should have proposed project objectives. If your business case is then approved and you move on to the second stage, the design stage, where you're actually planning the project, at that point you should have fixed objectives. So these objectives should communicate the purpose of the project in very clear, tangible forms. So we're not looking for things which are vague or general. We're not looking for improve this or make this part of the organization better. We want something that can be achieved in a tangible terms and something that can be measured. So going back to SMART objectives, so specific, measurable, actionable, and time-bound objectives will be really quite important. We do want things which are very specific, and we want them to capture the required elements of the project. We don't want to throw anything additional in there thinking, well, if we have time, it would also be good to achieve this objective. or if we achieve everything else, then maybe we can push the project to achieve a few other things. That leads to scope creep. Just like having too much stuff in your work breakdown structure, which is not directly involved in achieving the specific deliverable you're focused on, having a bunch of objectives which may or may not be achieved and may or may not be critical to what the purpose of the project is, will lead to your scope increasing, and that's a major cause of project failure. And so we want to stick to just the required elements, and we want to focus on having objectives which are smart, which are tangible, which are measurable, very clear, and are restricted only to the agreed upon scope of the project. We don't want things that go outside of the scope. We want just the scope. So for example, if we're running a project to renovate a certain room, so let's use the university as an example, we want to renovate and redo classrooms within a particular building on campus, and someone says, well, if you guys have time, it'd be quite nice if you could also renovate the bathrooms, or it'd be quite nice if you could also renovate the canteen. Those are not things you want in your objective for the project. Your project has to say very, very narrow scope, a very clear scope, and you want to try and maximize the chances of your project succeeding on that basis, on those particular objectives. Making sure they're measurable is also important, because this means after the project has finished, so particularly after the third do stage of the project lifecycle, we've carried out all of the actual work involved in the project, so everything on the work breakdown structure. And we're moving to the fourth stage, the develop stage, which is where we also start to close the project and we start to look at lessons learned, and we start evaluating whether the project was a success or not. We want to be able to look at the objectives and be able to have a clear objective measurement of whether we've achieved those objectives or not. Improve sales is not really an objective. Improve sales by 50% is more of an objective, or to say that your objective is to going back to our example about renovating rooms, make the room look better is not an objective. To repaint the walls, put new carpeting in, and to install new lecture machines, those are objectives. Make the room look better is general, it's vague, it can be interpreted in a number of different ways. We can't really measure whether we've made the room look better, but we can measure if we've replaced the carpets, if we've repainted the walls, if we've installed a new projector. Those are things which can be measured. So we do want to make sure that our project objectives are very much specific, they're measurable, and they're tangible. So those are our project objectives. If we move on to the second of the two that we're focusing on, and those will be benefits, intended benefits or project benefits. Now, we have to be really clear that project benefits are not objectives. They're two very distinct things, and if you get them confused when you're developing a project, or you're defining a project rather, you can make it a nightmare scenario where it's very difficult to judge the success of a project or not. So the project benefits are not to do with what you hope to achieve in the project, so they're not objectives. The actual long-term and underlying benefits that the project activities are designed to bring about. So they're you could have an understanding that they're the underlying things we're trying to bring into the organization or into the operation. So while our objectives are very much focused on the work that we're doing in the project, so to go back to our example about renovating classrooms, those will be the objectives. They are, things to do with the work that we're doing in the project, like, replacing the carpets and repainting the walls. But those aren't the benefits. The benefits will be the purpose behind actually doing those objectives, the purpose behind doing the project activities. And those should not be expressed in relation to the project, but expressed in relation to the organization or the wider operation. So for a classroom renovation project, we can say that the benefits would be a better learning environment, or a greater student engagement, or a more pleasant teaching physical environment. So you can tell some of those are vague, some of those are not specific or measurable, they're not smart benefits. And that's because if you do have measurable benefits, that's brilliant, but benefits can be intangible as well. So if you're looking at the classroom renovation project, maybe some of your benefits can be tangible. You can say that you want to boost student attendance. And one of the benefits of renovating the classroom is that you expect attendance to go up by, say, 20%, or you expect attendance to increase by 10%. So that would be a tangible benefit that we can evaluate in an objective sense. But there will be other really important benefits which are not necessarily tangible at all and are actually intangible or vague. So while we don't want any vague objectives whatsoever, we are perfectly happy to have vague or intangible project benefits that we can assess in a qualitative rather than quantitative manner. And that's because while we should be able to assess in the fourth stage of our typical project lifecycle, so as soon as all of the activities in the work breakdown structure are actually finished, either straight away or shortly afterwards, we should be able to assess whether we've achieved our objectives. Sometimes the project benefits can take a much longer time to evaluate. So if one of our objectives is attendance improving, we would have to wait at least one semester, maybe 2 semesters, before we can see if attendance has improved by 10% as we want it to, in order to assess the benefits of renovating the classroom. If we're looking for greater engagement and a more pleasant environment, maybe we'll have to wait a couple of semesters or an entire academic school year, and then interview or send a questionnaire around, or some kind of qualitative measurement to see if the users, stakeholders, in this case the students and the teaching faculty, actually do believe that it's made a more pleasant environment and it has engaged, improved student engagement during lectures and seminars. So we can have a much longer time frame to actually evaluate and assess project benefits than you would typically have to evaluate and assess project objectives. So this means that in many cases, particularly with large complex projects, you actually have a separate stream of the project manager's role is to focus on benefit realization. So you have a benefits review document that you produce at the end, and it can sometimes be a fairly lengthy process of benefits management. So if we see on the goal here, and this is taken from the PMI, the Project Management Institute's a book of knowledge, where they go into significant detail as to the best practices of benefits management. So you'd have your delivery of the project. So this is the element in the center, highlighted in light blue, labeled delivery at the top. That would be your where you'd actually do the work for the project itself. Now you may actually start to realize some benefits immediately as you're carrying out the activities in the work breakdown structure. So as you're actually doing the activities of the project, or the third phase of our 4-stage mod life cycle. But these are not going to be the total sum of benefits. So it's when you embed that change, when you actually transition from a project over to operational running, you really start realizing the majority of the benefits, and certainly the most important benefits. So it's that embedding of change, that transition from the project lifecycle over to the operational lifecycle, the ongoing business as usual operations within an organization. You really start to realize the benefits from the project. So this means that while the majority of our project activities will be complete, we'll close out the contracts, we'll complete the payment for the new carpet, we'll complete the payment for the walls, would release the project team back into their everyday operational roles. So most of the project will be shut down, but we would want to continue our benefits management process for a couple of semesters until we've really been able to review and measure the benefits from the organization as a whole. So really it would be a combination of these two, project objectives and project benefits, that give us the best mechanism to have a real full measurement of project success. If we're able to compare, contrast and evaluate the project objectives as well as the project benefits, we're able to have a fully rounded understanding of whether our project was successful or not. But it is worth highlighting that you can have a mixed bag with both of these. It is possible to have achieved your objectives but failed to realize your benefits, or to have failed in part your objectives but still realize the benefits that were intended. So there can be a combination of both, and we can see a few examples of this. So a fairly typical example, which would probably be the case for quite a few universities. So let's say your project objectives are to build a new facility, and you have specific cost, time and quality constraints. So our iron triangle of those three major project constraints of cost, time and quality, and you've hit everything on those constraints. So you're under budget or on budget, you're on time, and you've hit the required quality. So you've achieved all of your project objectives, but you haven't realized the benefits because we simply haven't had full use of physical university facilities for almost exactly a year now, or it's been a significant period of time. There's been patches of teaching, but we haven't fully used the facilities, and therefore it's very difficult for us to assess whether the benefits that were intended have actually been realized. So for this, we can either say we've failed to achieve the benefits, or we can say, well, because of the pandemic, we have to extend the project timeline and actually keep monitoring the benefits for an additional year or 2 years before we can conclusively state whether the benefits were achieved. You can have other cases where you can actually just fail to achieve your benefits altogether. So in this example here, you have project objectives to develop a new terminal at a particular airport, and you've got your cost, time and quality constraints. So you have developed very specific measurable project objectives, and you've met all of those. You've achieved all of the project objectives. However, you haven't realized the benefits because rising demand while you were constructing the terminal, so during the actual project execution phase, means that you still don't have enough capacity to meet the demand that you have. So in this case, the project benefits would clearly be, we want to build this new terminal in order to add capacity and to be able to meet demand. That would be the obvious benefit for developing a new terminal. But if you've handed over the new terminal and that extra capacity is still insufficient to meet that demand, well, you haven't achieved your project benefit. This should feed into a lessons learned report, which the project manager would always do in the last fourth stage of a project lifecycle, which is the develop stage, is actually reflect on the fact that the project itself wasn't properly conceived, that there was a misjudgment about the amount of capacity that was needed, that led to establishing faulty project objectives, which then led to the fact that even though those faulty objectives were met, the benefits still weren't achieved. We failed to add the amount of extra capacity we needed to add. So perhaps in the lessons learned report, you'd reflect that actually we needed a much larger terminal. We needed to plan the project at much greater scale in order to achieve the benefits that we needed to achieve. As well as this, you can have the reverse as well, where you can achieve the benefits but fail to achieve the project objectives. So an example here, you have your project where you're introducing a new internal productivity platform in an organization. So maybe introducing Slack, or introducing fully using all of the features of Microsoft Office 365, or whatever the chosen productivity platform is. And you have your SMART objectives, your specific and your measurable objectives in place, and these were only partially achieved. Perhaps you had major budget overruns, and maybe you missed your schedule by a significant amount. However, in the long run, you still realize the benefits that you were intending to have from the project. So employees still adapt to the new platform and are happy. Productivity increases with whatever measures you may have to evaluate that. So the project benefits were still very much achieved. In this case, in the lessons learned report, the project manager would go back and perhaps examine maybe how the project objectives were set. So maybe the budget and the schedule weren't adequate. Maybe look at how the project was executed. Maybe identify things that could have been done better to minimize cost and time overruns, but still recognize that the benefits that the project was aiming for were still very much achieved.